Remember the smell of wood smoke and wild meat on Christmas morning in the mountains?
We didn't have much, but we had each other. And that was enough to call it Christmas.
Between 1920 and 1965, 30 Christmas dinners ruled Appalachian tables like survival blueprints. These weren't recipes, they were poverty transformed into celebration, hunger turned into feast. Today they've vanished because we abandoned tradition for shame, forgetting what our grandparents survived on. We're racing to capture all 30 before the last hillbilly grandmothers who cooked them die. And share this with the one person you wish could sit at these forgotten hillbilly Christmas dinner tables with you. Walk into a mountain cabin on Christmas morning, 1935, when sugar was precious and neighbors brought gifts you could eat. Stack cake wasn't just dessert, it was community. Each family would bake one thin layer of cake and bring it to the Christmas house. Grandma would stack them high, spreading cooked dried apples between each layer like mortar. The apples had been drying on the roof all summer, turning leathery and sweet. By the time 10 families contributed layers, the cake stood tall as a child's arm. You had to let it sit overnight so the apple filling would soften the layers into one united cake. Slicing it revealed stripes of gold and brown, sweet and spice. Step back to 1940, when green beans didn't come in cans, and winter meant eating what you'd hung from the rafters in October. Leather breeches were green beans, strung on thread like necklaces and dried until they turned brown and shriveled. On Christmas Eve, Grandma would cut down a string, soak them overnight, then cook them all day with a ham hock and a little bacon grease. The beans would plump back up, but they kept this smoky, concentrated flavor that fresh beans never had. They were dark and rich and tasted like summer captured in leather. The pot would simmer on the wood stove for hours, filling the cabin with smell that meant feast was coming. Nobody grows enough beans to dry anymore. Nobody has rafters full of leather breeches waiting for winter. Picture Christmas 1928, when the turkey came from the woods, not the store, and cost nothing but a good shot and a day of hiking. Grandpa would head out before dawn on December 20th, walking miles into the deep forest where wild turkeys roosted in tall oaks. When he came back with a bird slung over his shoulder, the whole family celebrated. Meat was never guaranteed. The wild turkey was smaller than store birds, darker, stronger tasting. Grandma would rub it with lard and mountain herbs, then roast it over hickory coals in the yard, turning it slowly for hours. The skin turned black and crispy. Go back to a December afternoon in 1932 when cornbread wasn't side dish but main event, and cracklins made it Christmas-worthy. Cracklins, a pork skin and fat cooked down until crispy, what's left after making lard. Grandma saved them all year in a jar, and at Christmas she'd crumble them into her cornbread batter. Stone-ground cornmeal, buttermilk, eggs, and those precious cracklins. She'd bake it in a cast-iron skillet, so hot the bottom turned crusty and golden. When you broke open a piece, little nuggets of crispy pork fat would be scattered throughout like savory treasures. It was rich and crumbly and made you feel wealthy, even when you weren't. Cracklin' cornbread filled you up when meat was scarce. Walk into Christmas 1925, when eating possum wasn't poverty but tradition, and sweet potatoes grew in every backyard garden. Grandpa would trap a fat possum in November, keep it in a pen, and feed it clean corn for 2 weeks to clear its system. That was the secret to good-tasting possum. On Christmas Eve, he'd prepare it while Grandma peeled sweet potatoes from the root cellar. The possum would roast in the oven surrounded by those sweet potatoes. Stop right there for just a second. You think those 5 dinners were strange? You haven't seen anything yet. The next 25 meals show you how mountain people turned nothing into everything, how they celebrated Christmas with skill instead of money. Step into a cabin on Christmas 1938, when the Great Depression still had its grip on the mountains, and fancy food was someone else's story. Soup beans, Pinto beans cooked low and slow with a ham bone and a little salt were Christmas dinner for families who had nothing else to offer, but Grandma made them special. She'd soak the beans overnight, cook them all morning in the biggest pot she owned, adding water when needed, stirring every half hour. Go back to Christmas morning, 1930, when Grandpa would bring in 3 rabbits he'd snared the day before, and Grandma would turn them into a feast that lasted all day. She'd cut those rabbits into pieces, soak them in buttermilk overnight to tenderize the meat, then dredge them in flour mixed with salt and pepper. Into the cast-iron skillet they'd go, frying in bacon grease until golden and crispy as fried chicken. After the rabbit came out, Grandma would make gravy in that same skillet, adding flour to the drippings, stirring until brown, then slowly pouring in fresh milk until it turned thick and creamy. The gravy got poured over biscuits she'd made that morning, with pieces of fried rabbit on the side. The meat was mild and tender, the gravy was rich and peppery, and the whole meal cost nothing but time and skill. Rabbit fed mountain families for generations. Now people think rabbit is pet food, not Christmas dinner. They don't know what they lost. Walk into 1942, wartime Christmas, when every bit of pork was rationed except what you raised yourself, and beans were freedom. Shucky beans were October's green beans, dried in their pods, shells and all, then broken into pieces. They looked like brown sticks, but Grandma knew their worth. She'd soak them overnight, then cook them slow with a piece of fat back, the layer of pork fat from a hog's back, mostly fat with a little meat striped through. That fat would melt into the beans over hours of cooking, making them rich and smoky and satisfying in ways that fresh beans could never touch. By evening, those shucky beans were soft and brown and tasted like somebody's grandmother loved you. You'd sop up the pot liquor with cornbread and feel like Christmas meant something, even when the world was at war. Shucky beans meant independence from stores and ration cards. Now nobody even knows what shucking beans means. December 23, 1926, when Grandpa and 3 uncles dug a pit in the yard 3 feet deep and 6 feet long. This was the Christmas hog, raised all year on scraps and acorns, butchered 2 days before, and about to become legend. They'd line that pit with rocks, build a fire inside it, and keep it burning for 12 hours until those rocks glowed red. Then they'd wrap the whole hog, gutted and cleaned but otherwise whole, in wet burlap sacks and chain-link fencing, lower it onto those hot rocks, and bury it completely under dirt. For 2 full days, that hog would cook underground in its own steam and smoke, the meat falling off the bone, the fat turning into liquid gold. On Christmas morning, they'd dig it up like buried treasure, unwrap it, and find pork so tender you could pull it apart with your fingers. The smell would travel half a mile. Every family for miles around would show up knowing they were invited to share. Pit cooking a hog took community and planning and knowledge about fire and earth that you can't learn from books. Nobody cooks underground anymore. Nobody has time or space or 10 extra people to feed. Step back to Christmas, 1931, when vegetables in winter meant what you'd canned or what you knew how to forage, and poke salad was both food and medicine. Pokeweed grows wild everywhere in the South, and it'll kill you if you prepare it wrong, but mountain grandmas knew exactly how to make it safe. They'd pick the young shoots in spring, boil them in 3 changes of water to remove the poison, then can them in jars for winter. At Christmas, Grandma would heat them up with bacon grease and vinegar, and they'd taste somewhere between spinach and something wild and earthy you couldn't name. Poke salad was free food that kept you healthy when there was no money for doctors or store vegetables. Children grew up knowing which plants would feed them and which ones would kill them, and that knowledge kept families alive. Now pokeweed is just a weed. People spray with chemicals. The knowledge of how to eat what grows free is dying with the grandmothers who held it. We're 10 dinners in, and you're starting to see it, aren't you? These weren't just meals. They were survival manuals written in recipes, passed down through generations, who understood that knowing how to feed yourself meant freedom. The next 10 dinners get even more resourceful. The knowledge gets deeper from here. If these lost Christmas dinners brought back memories, like the video and subscribe, so we can keep sharing the traditions that time almost forgot. Walk into a December evening in 1934, when Grandpa came home with 6 squirrels in his hunting bag, and Grandma transformed them into Christmas dinner that tasted like comfort and wildness combined. Squirrel meat is dark and rich, somewhere between chicken and rabbit, and it needs long, slow cooking to become tender. Grandma would cut those squirrels into pieces, brown them in a big pot with bacon grease, then cover them with water and simmer for 2 hours until the meat fell off the tiny bones. She'd pick out all the bones, tedious work that took patience, then make dumplings from flour, milk, and lard, dropping them into that bubbling squirrel broth 1 spoonful at a time. The dumplings would cook for 20 minutes, soaking up the rich, gamey flavor while getting fluffy and tender. The finished dish was thick as stew, hearty as any meal you could want, and it cost nothing but time and a good eye for tree branches where squirrels played. You'd eat it from bowls with spoons, sopping up every drop with cornbread, and feel satisfied deep in your bones. Squirrel dumplings fed mountain families every winter for 100 years. Now people think squirrels are pests or pets, not Christmas dinner. They've forgotten that survival sometimes tastes wild and gamey, and that's perfectly fine when you're grateful just to have something warm in your belly. Step back to Christmas 1929, when Grandpa trapped a fat groundhog in November and Grandma turned it into stew that nobody talks about anymore because admitting you ate groundhog means admitting you were poor. But let me tell you something. Groundhog done right tastes better than most meat rich people pay for. The secret was preparation. That groundhog would get skinned and cleaned, then soaked in salt water overnight to draw out the wild taste. The next day, Grandma would cut it into chunks and brown it in a Dutch oven with lard and onions. Then came the vegetables: potatoes, carrots, turnips, whatever the root cellar still held, and water to cover everything. She'd let that stew simmer for 3 hours until the groundhog meat turned tender and the broth turned rich and dark. The fat from the groundhog would rise to the top, and she'd skim some off, but leave enough to make the stew satisfying and keep you warm in the winter cold. The meat was dark and dense, tasting somewhere between pork and beef, and those vegetables soaked up the flavor until each bite was rich and earthy. Groundhog stew meant nobody went hungry even in the hardest years. Now people would starve before they'd eat groundhog, because they've forgotten that the land provides if you know how to see it. Pride kills more people than poverty ever did. Go back to Christmas 1936, when salt pork hanging in the smokehouse was wealth, and winter greens growing under snow were miracles you could eat. Salt pork was the belly and sides of the hog, packed in salt for months until it turned hard and white, and would last all winter without spoiling. On Christmas Day, Grandma would cut off a slab, soak it for a few hours to remove some salt, then slice it thick and fry it in her biggest skillet. The grease that rendered out would be used to cook the greens, collards or turnip greens or mustard greens, whatever had survived the first freeze and gotten sweeter from the cold. She'd chop those greens rough, pile them high in the pot, add the salt pork grease and a little water, then cook them down for an hour until they wilted into a silky, savory mess. The salt pork slices, now crispy as bacon but saltier and more intense, would get laid across the top. You'd eat this with cornbread to soak up the pot liquor, and the combination of salty meat, bitter greens, and sweet cornbread created balance that fancy restaurants try to recreate now but never quite achieve. Salt pork meant you'd survived hog-killing day and had meat for winter. Greens meant the garden still gave even in December. Together they meant Christmas was safe and full, and that mattered more than any store-bought ham ever could. Walk into Christmas 1927, when Grandpa shot a deer on December 15th, and the whole family worked together to butcher it before the meat could spoil. There were no freezers, so venison at Christmas meant Grandpa timed his hunt perfectly and butchered fast in the cold December air. The roast came from the hindquarter, a big piece of dark red meat that smelled clean and wild. Grandma would stud it with wild onions she'd dug from the creek bank, smaller and sharper than store onions, with green tops still attached. She'd rub the roast with lard and herbs, then cook it slow in the oven all morning while everyone went to church. By the time we got home, the cabin smelled like heaven and wilderness combined. That venison would be medium rare in the center, dark and crusty on the outside, and those wild onions would have melted into the meat, creating pockets of sharp, sweet flavor. You'd slice it thin, because wild meat is denser than farm meat, and serve it with whatever vegetables remained from the cellar. Venison tasted like the forest and freedom, like Grandpa's skill with a rifle and Grandma's skill with a stove. It was Christmas on your own terms, not dependent on stores or money or anything except knowledge passed down and land that still ran wild. Most people now have never tasted wild venison. They don't know that real meat has a story, has a name, has a forest it came from. Christmas morning, 1933, when Grandma would go to the chicken coop and choose 2 hens that had stopped laying eggs. They'd served their purpose, and now they'd serve a different one. By noon, those chickens would be plucked, cleaned, cut into pieces, and soaking in buttermilk in a covered bowl on the cold back porch. The buttermilk would tenderize the meat and add tang that made the flavor deeper. Around 3 in the afternoon, she'd dredge each piece in seasoned flour and fry them in a cast-iron skillet filled with lard, so hot it sizzled when the chicken touched it. The skin would turn golden and crackling crispy, the meat inside staying juicy and tender. After all the chicken came out, Grandma would make red-eye gravy, pouring coffee into that hot skillet with the leftover drippings, scraping up all the brown bits, letting it reduce until it turned reddish-brown and glossy. The gravy tasted like coffee and pork, and chicken all having a conversation, bitter and savory and completely unexpected. You'd pour it over biscuits and eat fried chicken with your hands, grease running down your fingers, and understand why people invented napkins. This wasn't Sunday chicken, this was Christmas chicken, made from hens who'd given eggs all year, and now gave one final gift. Nothing wasted, everything honored. That kind of respect for animals is gone now when chicken comes plastic wrapped and nobody remembers the bird it used to be. Step into 1924, when possum was a Christmas tradition, not a shameful secret, and the way Grandma prepared it made even suspicious eaters come back for seconds. The possum would be trapped in November, penned up, and fed clean corn and apples for 3 weeks. This was absolutely necessary to clear its system and improve the flavor. On Christmas Eve, Grandpa would prepare it while Grandma sliced apples from the barrel in the root cellar. The possum would be cleaned, rubbed with salt and pepper and lard, then placed in a roasting pan surrounded by those apple slices and a little water. Into the oven it went, slow roasting for 3 hours while the fat rendered out and the meat turned tender. Halfway through, Grandma would baste it with the drippings and add sweet potatoes around the edges. By dinner time, that possum would be golden brown, the meat falling off the bone, the apples cooked down into sauce, the sweet potatoes caramelized in possum fat. The meat was rich and dark, tasting like pork, but wilder, more complex, and those apples cut the richness perfectly. You'd eat it with cornbread and greens, and the whole meal felt abundant even when money was scarce. Possum meant resourcefulness. It meant using what the land provided. It meant not being too proud to eat what kept your ancestors alive. That humility is gone now, replaced by shame about foods that once meant survival and celebration combined. Go back to Christmas, 1939, when the smokehouse held treasure in the form of ham hocks, the joint between the pig's foot and leg, mostly bone and skin, but with enough meat and fat to flavor an entire pot of food. Grandma would choose 2 hocks from the smokehouse, dark and hard from months of hickory smoke, smelling like wood and salt and thyme. She'd place them in her biggest pot with water and a head of cabbage she'd pulled from the garden and kept in the cold cellar. That pot would simmer on the wood stove all day, filling the cabin with smell that made your stomach growl, even if you'd just eaten. By evening, the meat would be falling off those bones in shreds, the cabbage would be soft and silky, and the broth would be rich with pork fat and smoke and the sweet earthiness of cabbage. You'd fish out the bones, pull off every scrap of meat, and serve it in bowls with the cabbage and broth, sopping it up with cornbread. 1 ham hock fed 6 people easily, 2 fed 12. The bones would get saved for soup stock later. Nothing wasted, everything used. Ham hocks meant hog-killing day had gone well, that you'd survived another year, that Christmas dinner was guaranteed no matter how little money you had. Now ham hocks are considered scrap meat. People pass them over looking for prettier cuts, not understanding that flavor lives in the bones and fat, not the pretty parts. Walk into Christmas 1931, when Prohibition was the law, but mountain stills kept running because government rules didn't mean much in hollows too remote to patrol, and moonshine wasn't just for drinking, it was for cooking, too. Grandpa would bring home a mason jar of clear corn liquor from wherever he'd gotten it that week, and Grandma would use half of it to braise a pork shoulder for Christmas dinner. She'd brown that shoulder in her Dutch oven until it developed a dark crust, then pour in the moonshine, add some water, onions, and whatever herbs she'd dried that summer. The lid would go on tight, and the pot would go into the oven for 4 hours, while we all tried not to think about whether the revenuers might smell it cooking and come asking questions. The alcohol would cook off, leaving behind sweetness and complexity that regular water couldn't achieve, and that pork shoulder would become so tender you could shred it with a fork. The meat would be rich and falling apart. The sauce would be dark and glossy with rendered fat and reduced liquor, and the taste would be unlike anything you'd get from legal cooking. This wasn't about getting drunk. This was about using what you had, even if what you had was illegal. Moonshine braised pork meant you knew people who ran stills, meant you were part of a community that took care of its own outside the law. That kind of defiant self-sufficiency is exactly what the government wanted to destroy, which is exactly why mountain people kept doing it. Step back to Christmas Eve, 1928, when Grandma would bring up a jar of pickled pig's feet from the cellar and serve them as the appetizer before Christmas dinner, and half the people at the table would be excited while the other half would make faces and pretend they weren't hungry yet. Pig's feet were 4 feet from every hog, pure collagen and skin and tiny bones, and just enough meat to make them worth the effort. After hog-killing day in November, those feet would be boiled until tender, then packed into jars with vinegar, salt, pepper, onions, and hot peppers, and left to pickle for a month. By Christmas, they'd be ready, sour and spicy and gelatinous in a way that sounds terrible but tastes incredible if you grew up eating them. You'd pull a foot from the jar, bite into the tender skin, suck the meat off the small bones, and feel the vinegar wake up your whole mouth. The texture was soft and slippery. The flavor was tangy and porky, and the heat from those peppers built slowly. Pickled pig's feet weren't pretty, but they were pure protein preserved without refrigeration, and they proved you'd used every possible part of the hog except the squeal. Children would dare each other to try them. Adults would eat 3 or 4 while standing in the kitchen before dinner was even served. Now people think pig's feet are disgusting, which just means more for those of us who know better. Every part of the animal deserves respect and use. Wasting meat was sinful. Pickled pig's feet were practical and delicious, and if you can't handle that, your ancestors would be ashamed. Go back to Christmas morning, 1930, during the worst of the Depression, when breakfast before church was cornmeal mush with sorghum, and it had to hold you until after the Christmas dinner in the afternoon. Grandma would pour it into a bowl while it was still hot, make a well in the center, and pour in dark sorghum syrup that she'd gotten from the neighbor who grew sorghum cane and cooked it down every fall. The sorghum was thick and dark as motor oil, sweet and mineral-tasting with a hint of bitterness that kept it from being cloying. You'd stir that sorghum into the hot mush, watching it swirl through the pale yellow cornmeal like ribbons of liquid earth, then eat it with a spoon while it was still steaming. It was sweet and hearty and filling, and it cost almost nothing. Cornmeal from corn you grew, sorghum from the neighbor who'd accept a day's work in trade. Cornmeal mush kept families going through hard winters when there wasn't much else. It wasn't fancy, but it was fuel. And fuel mattered more than flavor when you had a long day of work and celebration ahead. Now people eat expensive granola and fancy oatmeal, never knowing that cornmeal mush with sorghum-filled bellies and fueled lives for generations before cereal came in boxes. Simple food isn't lesser food, it's honest food. 20 dinners down, and you're seeing the pattern now. These meals weren't about taste alone. They were about using everything, wasting nothing, surviving winter with dignity. The last 10 dinners hold the deepest knowledge. Stay with me. We're entering sacred territory now. Walk into a snow-covered cabin on Christmas Eve, 1922, when 3 rabbits hanging in the cold shed outside meant Christmas dinner was secured, and wild greens growing under the snow meant you had vegetables even in December. This was back when meat pies weren't fancy British food but practical mountain cooking, a way to stretch 3 rabbits into a meal that fed 15 people with enough left over for breakfast the next morning. Grandpa had snared those rabbits over the past week, checking his traps every morning in the frozen woods, and now they hung stiff and ready in the shed where the cold kept them fresh. Grandma would bring them inside one at a time, skin them on the kitchen table with a knife older than she was, and cut the meat into chunks. She'd brown those pieces in her Dutch oven with lard and onions, then add water and let them simmer for 2 hours until the meat was falling apart, tender. While the rabbit cooked, she'd send the kids outside to dig through the snow for winter cress and dandelion greens. They grew year-round if you knew where to look, and the cold made them sweeter, less bitter. We'd come back with baskets full of dark green leaves, frost still clinging to them, and Grandma would chop them rough and add them to the pot. Next came the vegetables from the root cellar: potatoes, carrots, onions, turnips, all diced small and thrown in. She'd season everything with salt, pepper, and herbs she'd dried that summer, then let it all simmer together for another hour until the cabin smelled like Christmas and survival combined. The liquid would reduce into thick gravy, rich with rabbit fat and vegetable starch. While the filling cooled slightly, Grandma would roll out pie dough she'd made that morning: flour, lard, cold water, and salt, and line her biggest cast-iron skillet with it. The rabbit and vegetable mixture would go in, steaming and fragrant. Then another layer of dough on top, crimped at the edges and slashed to let steam escape. Into the oven it went, baking until the crust turned golden brown and flaky. When she pulled it out and cut into it, the filling would be bubbling at the edges, and the smell would make your mouth water so hard you'd forget you were supposed to wait for grace before eating. That first bite, flaky crust, tender rabbit, sweet vegetables, wild greens adding slight bitterness to balance the richness, proved that poverty and pride weren't opposites. You could be poor and still create something beautiful. Rabbit pie meant the land provided if you knew how to look, how to trap, how to find greens under snow, how to make enough for everyone from what seemed like nothing. That knowledge is almost gone now, along with the grandmothers who held it. Step back to Christmas morning 1937, when Grandpa would walk to the creek before sunrise with a cane pole and a can of night crawlers he'd dug the evening before, and come back 3 hours later with a stringer full of catfish so fresh they were still moving. Christmas catfish was tradition in hollows near water. Creek catfish, river catfish, pond catfish. It didn't matter as long as they were fresh caught and cleaned properly. Catfish have whiskers and smooth skin instead of scales, and they taste like the water they came from. Muddy if the creek was muddy, clean if the water was cold and clear. December catfish were always best because the cold water made them firm and sweet. Grandma would take those catfish, cut off their heads, gut them, and skin them with pliers. Catfish skin is tough and needs to be peeled, not scaled. She'd cut them into chunks, soak them in buttermilk for an hour to remove any muddy taste, then dredge them in cornmeal mixed with salt, pepper, and a little flour. The lard in her biggest cast-iron skillet would be heating to smoking hot, and when those catfish pieces hit that oil, they'd sizzle and pop and turn golden brown in just a few minutes. The cornmeal coating would get crunchy as fried chicken skin, and the fish inside would stay white and flaky and mild. While the fish fried, Grandma would make hush puppies, little balls of cornmeal batter with onions mixed in, dropped by spoonfuls into the same hot oil. The name came from fishermen who'd fry these to throw to barking dogs to make them hush up, but they became a staple because they were delicious and used the same ingredients as cornbread, but in a form you could eat with your hands. The hush puppies would puff up and turn dark gold, crispy outside, soft inside, savory from the onions. You'd eat fried catfish and hush puppies with your hands, standing around the kitchen while they were still too hot, burning your fingers and mouth and not caring because fresh fish fried in lard on Christmas morning was worth any amount of minor pain. This meal came from the creek, the hen house, for eggs in the batter, the corn crib, and knowledge about where catfish hide in winter. It cost nothing but effort and skill and the confidence that comes from knowing how to feed yourself from what's around you. Fried catfish meant you lived near water and knew how to use it. Hush puppies meant you didn't waste batter or oil. Everything got cooked, everything got eaten. Now people buy frozen fish that was caught by strangers in oceans they'll never see, and they've forgotten the specific joy of eating fish that was swimming in your own creek just hours before. That connection to place, to water, to the exact source of your food, that's gone now, along with the understanding that Christmas dinner shouldn't come from a store if it can come from the land instead. Go back to Christmas 1932, the hardest year of the Depression, when nobody had much but everyone had something, and stone soup wasn't a fairy tale, but actual practice that kept entire communities alive. This Christmas dinner happened at the church, the only building big enough to hold 50 people, and it started with one family bringing a pot, another bringing water, and someone as a joke throwing in a clean stone from the creek. That stone sat in the bottom of that pot while the real miracle happened around it. The first family added 3 potatoes from their cellar. The second family brought a turnip and 2 carrots. The third family contributed a ham bone with a little meat still on it, precious protein from their last hog. Another family brought dried beans they'd been saving. Someone else added a jar of canned tomatoes from their summer garden. A widow brought wild onions she'd dug that morning. A young couple contributed a bag of cornmeal for dumplings. An old man brought herbs he'd dried on his windowsill. One by one, every family added what they could spare, and nobody gave so much that they'd go hungry, but everyone gave something that mattered. Grandma and the other women took charge of the cooking, building up the fire in the church stove, adding ingredients in the right order. Meat first, then hard vegetables, then softer things, then seasonings. That pot simmered for 3 hours, while people sang carols and children played in the snow outside, and men stood around talking about weather and wondering if next year would be better. The smell of that soup filled the church like incense, and when it was finally ready, Grandma would fish out the stone to save for next year's stone soup, then ladle the thick, rich mixture into bowls and cups, and anything that could hold liquid. Everyone ate until they were full, truly full, not just making do full, and there was enough left over for people to take some home for the next day. Stone soup tasted like community. It tasted like no one family could make it alone, but together we could create abundance from scraps. Every spoonful held vegetables from different gardens, meat from different hogs, herbs from different windowsills, and the combined knowledge of women who knew how to turn nothing into everything. The stone itself did nothing. It was just a symbol, a story starter, a way to let everyone contribute without shame, because we were all just adding to the stone soup, not admitting we needed charity. That kind of pride-saving generosity is gone now. Now we have food banks and government programs which help people survive, but don't create the same community that stone soup did. Nobody knows their neighbors well enough anymore to throw their last potato into a shared pot and trust that everyone else will do the same. We lost that trust somewhere along the way to prosperity, and I'm not sure we're better off for it. Walk into Christmas, 1926, when Grandpa and two uncles had tracked a black bear for 3 days through December snow, finally getting a clean shot on the 20th and dragging 300 pounds of bear meat back to the cabin on a sled. Bear hunting was dangerous and difficult and sometimes went wrong, but when it went right, one bear could feed multiple families for weeks. The meat was dark red, almost purple, rich and strong-flavored and fatty in ways that lean deer meat never was. Grandma would take a roast from the hindquarter, maybe 10 pounds of solid meat, and prepare it with the same care she'd give to any sacred thing. First came the marinade. She'd rub the roast with salt, pepper, wild herbs, and vinegar, then let it sit overnight in the cold shed to tenderize and mellow the wild flavor. Bear meat could taste too strong if you cooked it fresh, but proper preparation made it delicious and complex. The next day, she'd brown it on all sides in her biggest Dutch oven, then add water and every root vegetable the cellar still held. Potatoes, carrots, turnips, parsnips, onions, even beets that would turn everything slightly pink. The pot would go into the oven and cook low and slow for 4 hours, the cabin filling with smell that was wild and civilized at the same time. By dinner, that bear roast would be tender enough to cut with a fork. The fat would have rendered out and enriched the vegetables, and the broth at the bottom would be dark and intensely flavorful. You'd slice the meat thick, serve it with those vegetables, and pour that rich broth over everything. Bear meat tasted like the forest, gamey and powerful, and a little bit dangerous even on your plate. Children would be told to eat small bites and chew well. Adults would eat quietly, savoring meat that represented skill and courage, and 3 days of tracking through snow. One roast would feed 12 people, and the rest of the bear would be smoked or salted or shared with families who'd helped with the butchering. Bear meat meant Grandpa was a provider, that he had the skill and courage to hunt dangerous animals when necessary. It meant the family would have fat, precious fat that could be rendered for cooking, that would keep everyone's calories high during the hungry months. It meant Christmas was secure. Now bear hunting is restricted, controlled, permitted, and most people would never eat bear, even if they could get it legally. They think it's too wild, too gamey, too connected to nature to be proper food. They've lost the understanding that dangerous animals can become Christmas dinner, that hunting isn't sport, but survival, that the meat you worked hardest for tastes best because you earned it with sweat and skill and 3 days of frozen feet trudging through December snow. Step into Christmas morning, 1940, when breakfast before church was milk gravy and biscuits, and it had to be good enough and filling enough to hold everyone through a 2-hour service and the wait until Christmas dinner in the afternoon. This wasn't fancy food. It was fundamental food, the kind of meal that built Appalachia and kept children growing and men working and women managing households on next to nothing. But when Grandma made it, Milk, gravy, and biscuits became something close to sacred. The biscuits came first. She'd start before dawn, mixing flour, lard, buttermilk, salt, and a little baking powder in a bowl until the dough came together rough and shaggy. She'd turn it out on a floured board, pat it down gently, and cut circles with an old tin can that had once held coffee. Those biscuits would go into a hot oven. She could tell the temperature by how long she could hold her hand inside, and bake for 12 minutes until they were golden on top, fluffy inside, layered like they'd been made with cream instead of poverty. While the biscuits baked, she'd make the gravy, flour cooked in bacon grease until it smelled nutty and turned golden, then milk poured in slowly while whisking constantly to prevent lumps. The gravy would thicken as it cooked, and she'd season it with salt and more black pepper than seemed reasonable. Mountain people liked pepper, liked the heat and bite that woke you up in the morning. When the gravy was thick enough to coat the back of a spoon but thin enough to pour, she'd take it off the heat. The biscuits would come out of the oven steaming and perfect, and she'd split them open while they were hot, laying them on plates. The gravy would get ladled over those split biscuits generously, soaking into the fluffy insides, pooling on the plate. You'd eat this with a fork, cutting through soft biscuit and creamy gravy, each bite rich with fat and flour and milk and pepper. This meal cost pennies. Flour was cheap. Lard was rendered from hogs you raised. Milk came from your own cow. Pepper was one of the few spices everyone could afford. But the technique, knowing how to make biscuits that were tender, not tough, gravy that was smooth, not lumpy, that took years to learn and a lifetime to perfect. Milk, gravy, and biscuits filled you completely, stuck to your ribs, and gave you energy for whatever the day held. It tasted like home, like morning, like the kind of comfort that doesn't need to be expensive to be real. Now, people eat breakfast cereal that costs $5 a box and wonder why they're hungry again in an hour. They've forgotten that real food, simple food made with skill and fat and flour, keeps you full because your body recognizes it as actual nourishment, not processed fluff with vitamins sprayed on. Milk, gravy, and biscuits was breakfast for people who worked hard and needed fuel, not entertainment. That understanding, that food is fuel first, pleasure second, has been lost in a culture that treats eating like entertainment and wonders why everyone's sick. 5 dinners left, and these are the ones that defined Christmas in the mountains. The meals that grandmothers made when they wanted to prove their worth, when they needed to show that poverty doesn't mean you can't create beauty. The techniques in these last 5 recipes took lifetimes to master. Stay with me to the end. Go back to Christmas afternoon, 1923, right after Hog Killing Day in November, when every part of the pig was used for something, and what remained after rendering lard became the foundation for Christmas bread that tasted like pure pork and happiness combined. Cracklins are the skin and fat of the pig after you've cooked out all the liquid lard. They're crispy, crunchy, salty, rich, and completely irresistible. Most families would eat them as snacks throughout the winter, but Grandma saved some specifically for Christmas cracklin bread that elevated cornbread into something almost holy. She'd crumble a cup of cracklins into her cornbread batter, stone-ground cornmeal, buttermilk, eggs, salt, and just enough flour to hold it together. But here's what made her recipe special. Instead of butter or plain lard, she'd use what she called grease, the rendered fat from the bottom of the crackling's pot, still warm and liquid, with all that pork flavor concentrated into pure liquid gold. She'd pour that grease into her cast-iron skillet first, swirl it around to coat the bottom and sides, heat it until it was smoking hot, then pour in the batter. The hot grease would immediately start cooking the edges, creating a crust that would become dark brown and crispy as it baked. Into the oven it went, and 25 minutes later she'd pull out cornbread that was golden on top, dark and crusty on the bottom and sides, and studded throughout with crispy cracklin pieces that added texture and intense pork flavor to every bite. When you broke off a piece while it was still hot, steam would rise from the inside, and little pockets of melted grease would be visible throughout the crumb. The first bite was always the best: crunchy crust, tender middle, explosions of salty cracklin', and that underlying pork richness that made you understand why people used to value fat as much as meat. Cracklin' bread wasn't side dish. It was the main event. You'd eat it with beans or greens or by itself, and it would fill you up completely because it was essentially meat and grain combined into one package. This was poverty cooking at its finest, taking the scraps from lard making and transforming them into something people would fight over, something that tasted expensive and luxurious, despite costing nothing but knowledge and effort. Now people are afraid of fat, afraid of pork, afraid of anything that tastes too rich or makes them feel too full. They eat low-fat everything and wonder why they're never satisfied. Cracklin' bread satisfied you completely because it was real food made with real fat, and your body knew exactly what to do with it. That wisdom, that fat, isn't the enemy. That pork grease can be the foundation of delicious food. That the scraps from one process can become the stars of another. That wisdom is dying with the generation who lived it. Walk into Christmas 1925, when Grandpa and a hunting party tracked a wild boar for 2 days through the deepest part of the forest, finally cornering it in a ravine and taking it down with 3 rifle shots. Wild boar weren't native to these mountains originally, but some had escaped from game preserves decades earlier and gone feral, and by the 1920s they were spreading through the woods like ghosts. Dangerous, smart, and almost impossible to hunt successfully. When Grandpa dragged that boar back to the cabin, the whole community knew Christmas was going to be special because wild boar tasted like nothing else in the world. The meat was darker than domestic pork, tougher, more intensely flavored, with fat that was harder and white as snow. Grandma took the ham, the hind leg, maybe 15 pounds of solid meat, and prepared it like she was preparing treasure. She'd rub it with salt and let it cure overnight, then rinse it and prepare the glaze. Cane syrup from the neighbor who grew sugar cane and boiled it down every fall, mixed with a little vinegar and black pepper to cut the sweetness. That glaze would get painted on the ham thick. Then she'd roast it low and slow for 5 hours, basting it every 30 minutes with more glaze, until the outside turned black and shiny and caramelized. When she pulled it out, the smell would be so intense, sweet and savory and smoky and wild all at once, that everyone in the cabin would stop what they were doing and just stare at it. She'd let it rest for 20 minutes, then carve it thin because wild meat is too dense to eat in thick slices. Each slice would be dark mahogany colored with a black glazed crust, and when you ate it, the flavor was complex, sweet from the cane syrup, salty from the cure, gamey from the wild boar, with a slight bitterness from the caramelized sugars. The fat would be chewy and rich, the meat would be tender despite coming from a wild animal, and every bite would taste like accomplishment and skill and the forest itself. Wild boar ham meant your grandfather was brave enough and skilled enough to hunt dangerous game. It meant your grandmother knew how to take tough wild meat and transform it into something tender and sweet. It meant Christmas dinner came from courage, not the grocery store. Now wild boar are still in these mountains, but they're considered pests, nuisances, invasive species to be eliminated, not game to be respected and eaten. People hire exterminators to shoot them and leave them rotting in the forest instead of turning them into Christmas dinner. That waste, that disrespect for wild meat that could feed families, that refusal to use what the land provides, that's the real tragedy. Our ancestors would look at us throwing away hundreds of pounds of good meat and wonder how we became so wealthy that we can afford to waste food, so disconnected that we forgot wild animals are supposed to be eaten, not exterminated and discarded. Step back to Christmas Eve, 1935, to the meal that divided families, that separated people who grew up poor from people who grew up poor and ashamed of it, that proved whether you remembered where you came from or spent your life pretending you didn't. Chitterlings, pronounced chitlins by everyone who actually ate them, are pig intestines, cleaned thoroughly, boiled for hours, then fried or boiled again, depending on regional preference. They smell terrible while cooking, they look worse, and they taste like something you either grew up eating or you hate with your entire being. There's no middle ground with chitlins. After hog killing day, someone had to clean those intestines, turn them inside out, scrape out everything inside, wash them in multiple changes of water until they ran clear, then wash them again. This job usually fell to the women, and it took hours of disgusting work that nobody wanted to do, but everybody understood was necessary, because wasting any part of the hog was sinful when you were poor. Once cleaned, the chitterlings would be cut into sections, boiled in a huge pot with onions, garlic, and bay leaves for 3 to 4 hours until they became tender. The smell during this process was indescribable, not exactly bad, but intensely organ-like, primal, something that made children leave the house and adults question their life choices. But here's the thing. Once they were done cooking, once Grandma had drained them and either fried them crispy or served them boiled with vinegar and hot sauce, they became something different. The texture was chewy but tender. The flavor was rich and porky and slightly minerally, and with enough hot sauce on them, they tasted like tradition and persistence and refusal to waste anything just because it wasn't pretty. You'd eat chitlins with cornbread and greens, and the combination was somehow perfect. The bitterness of greens, the sweetness of cornbread, the rich chewiness of chitlins, and the burn of hot sauce, creating a meal that was complex and satisfying and unmistakably soul food before anyone called it that. Eating chitlins on Christmas meant you remembered that poverty teaches you to use everything, that the parts rich people throw away can feed families if you're willing to do the work. It meant you weren't ashamed of where you came from or what your grandmother had to do to keep everyone fed. Now, chitlins are mostly gone, even from soul food restaurants, because younger generations think they're disgusting, unsanitary, too difficult, too smelly, too connected to slavery and poverty to be worth preserving. They don't understand that chitlins represent triumph over waste, creativity in the face of deprivation, and the kind of culinary skill that can transform literal garbage into food that sustained entire communities. The government tried to eliminate chitlins through health codes and regulations, claiming they were unsafe, but really they wanted to erase food traditions that reminded people they used to know how to survive on nothing. Chitlins are resistance food. They're pride food disguised as poverty food. And losing them means losing the understanding that nothing, absolutely nothing, should be wasted when people need to eat. Walk into Christmas morning, 1930, when Grandpa brought in 5 squirrels he'd shot at dawn, and Grandma transformed them into gravy rich enough to prove that poor people knew how to eat like kings if they had the right skills and the right attitude. Squirrel gravy wasn't common Christmas dinner. It was what you made when deer hunting hadn't gone well, when the hog had been smaller than expected, when money was so tight that store-bought anything was impossible. But Grandma could make squirrel gravy taste like you'd planned it all along, like it was exactly what Christmas was supposed to taste like. She'd skin and clean those squirrels, cut them into pieces, and brown them hard in bacon grease until they developed a dark crust. Then she'd add water and simmer them for 2 hours until the meat fell off the tiny bones. The tedious part came next, picking through all that meat to remove every single bone fragment, leaving only shredded squirrel meat. Back into the pot it went, along with flour to thicken the liquid into gravy, more bacon grease for richness, salt, pepper, and whatever herbs she had dried. The gravy would simmer for another 30 minutes, becoming thick and brown and intensely flavored, gamey and rich and satisfying in ways that chicken gravy could never match. Step into Christmas night, 1938, after the big meal was done and people were gathering again for a lighter supper before bed, when Grandma would make leather breeches soup, a thin, simple broth made from beans that had been hanging from the rafters since October, cooked gently with a ham bone and served with corn pone so fresh it was still steaming. This was the quieter meal. The family-only meal after relatives had gone home, and it was just the immediate household sitting around the table in lamplight, tired and happy and grateful that Christmas had gone well. Leather breeches, beans, green beans strung on thread and dried until they looked like brown leather pants hanging from the ceiling, would get cut down from their string, soaked overnight to soften, then cooked slowly in a big pot with a meaty ham bone left over from Christmas dinner. The beans would take hours to become fully tender, plumping back up, but retaining that concentrated, smoky flavor that fresh beans never had. The broth would turn dark and rich from the ham bone, and the beans would be silky and almost melting. Grandma would season it simply with salt and pepper, maybe a little onion, but nothing that would overpower the essential flavor of beans and pork and thyme. While the soup simmered, she'd make corn pone, a more primitive version of cornbread made with just cornmeal, water, and salt, patted into small ovals, and fried in a skillet with a little grease until crusty and golden on both sides. Corn pone was denser than cornbread, chewier, more substantial, and it soaked up soup beautifully without falling apart. You'd break the hot corn pone into your bowl of leather breeches soup, let it absorb the broth, then eat it with a spoon while the family sat quietly around the table, too full and tired for much conversation, but content in the silence that comes from a day well spent. This meal cost almost nothing. Beans you'd dried yourself, a bone that would have been thrown away, cornmeal from your own corn, a little grease. But it tasted like completion, like the final chapter of Christmas, like coming home after a long journey. The simplicity was the point. After a day of rich food and celebration, leather breeches soup was a return to fundamentals, a reminder that the everyday food that kept you alive all year was also worthy of gratitude and respect. The last meal of Christmas, being the simplest meal, showed proper priorities. You could celebrate with abundance when possible, but you never forgot that survival came from simple foods prepared with skill and eaten with thankfulness. Leather breeches soup is gone now because nobody dries beans on strings anymore. Nobody has rafters full of food waiting for winter. Nobody saves ham bones to cook later because store-bought bones don't have enough meat to bother with. We've lost the entire system that made this meal possible. The drying, the storing, the saving, the understanding that Christmas cooking starts in October when you hang beans from the ceiling and continues through the winter as you carefully ration what you preserved. That long view of food, that patience with process, that respect for the full cycle from garden to table to soup pot, it's all vanishing. And when the last grandmother who dried leather breeches dies, this meal will become history instead of memory, words instead of taste, something people read about but never experience. That's the real loss. Not just the food, but the entire way of life that created it. So there they are. 30 Christmas dinners from the hills and hollows, made by grandmothers who understood that celebration doesn't require wealth, that feast comes from knowledge more than money, and that the best meals are the ones you earned with your own hands, from your own land, using skills passed down through generations who survived worse than you ever will, and who made sure you'd survive too, by teaching you everything they knew about making something from almost nothing. I close my eyes and I'm back on that mountain, sitting on the cold porch steps with my breath making clouds in the December air, watching wood smoke rise from the chimney in lazy spirals, while Grandma cooks inside that small cabin that somehow held more warmth than houses 10 times its size. The smell coming from that cabin, whether it's rabbit or possum or beans or squirrel, always meant the same thing. We're going to eat well, and we're going to eat together around that table that was too small for all of us, but we made it work anyway, squeezing in close, passing dishes hand to hand, nobody leaving until everyone had eaten their fill.